Now that we have understood a couple of psychological processes such as how do we perceive, how do we understand the world, how do we retain information that we acquire in our life, how emotions gets triggered. Now let us come to a very different type of a topic which has its origin in a controversy. Why are we the way we are? Is it that we have inherited certain things from our parents and therefore we behave in a particular way? Or is it that we have acquired certain things from our environment which makes us react to situation the way we do? So, nature nurture controversy that you always read about, that you always hear about, that is what we are going to discuss today. My basic intention is basically to introduce you to certain facts, scientific facts that has to do with genetics, and then I will take up certain findings of behavioral genetics to tell you that how is it that people give credit for that type of situation to the genetic makeup as well as to the environmental factors, the external factors. So, we would be basically talking about the gene environment interaction and how this interaction of the genetics and the environmental determinants, they provide base to our behavior. Now look at your screen, you see two kids, and then the obvious thing that you basically look at is the resemblance between the faces of these two children. Now this is something that we have always been told that say if you have twins, later on we will even discuss fraternal and identical twins. So, if you have no children of the same parents, if you have members of the same family and so forth, people do search for certain resemblance. That resemblance could be in terms of their appearance, and that resemblance could be even for certain other things. So, right now the two kids that you look at, you search for similarity in their physical appearance. Did you find anything? Look at this. Now both of them have grown up a bit. Again look at the resemblance between their faces. Now again try to match when they were younger compared to when they became little older, and now when they have further grown up. So the same kid, three different life stages of these two siblings, and you look at their resemblance. Now resemblance is something that we always look for when we look at any two objects. Here it is the human faces. Psychologically what we would be interested in is the resemblance in the pattern of response. So the siblings that we saw here, do they reflect certain type of mirror image in terms of their behavioral response? Say for instance, their pattern of interacting with others, their pattern of say certain choices, their behavioral manifestation of certain emotional states, is there a resemblance? And this is something that psychology gets interested in, and this is what brings genetics and psychology come together.
From the behavioral science point of view, when we look at a human being, we try to understand his or her personality, intelligence, memory, problem solving ability, thinking style and so forth. We are more interested in understanding the ability of what this very individual can do.
What we would do here as part of this very discussion is, we would initially spend some time understanding the genetic inheritance pattern. Then we would come across certain key terminologies, we will try to understand them, what each of them mean. Then we would also understand two basic processes, biological processes, the process of mutation and recombination that provides variation to human beings, both in terms of their appearance as well as in terms of their behavioral manifestations. And once we do all this, then we would gradually move towards behavioral genetics, where we would be taking a specific type of behavior, specific type of psychological abilities, and then try to see how much of credit for this type of an ability can be given to either psychology, the environment, or the genetics. We will even take care of certain issues like say phenylketonuria, say like autism, dyslexia. Okay, so we will try to take variations of example right from normal to clinical stuff, and then try to understand how this gene environment interaction takes place. So, coming back to the basis of genetic inheritance, we all know that human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and of this 23, 22 are autosomes. No? On your screen you see these 23 pairs, one pair is sex chromosome.
As I told you that we all have 23 pair of chromosomes, 22 pairs are autosomes and one is the sex chromosome.
So, if you inherit XX from the two parents, the father and the mother, then you become a female, and if you inherit Y from the father and X from the mother, then you become a male. So, this is the basic genetic inheritance that we are aware of. Chromosomes, usually this is how you see, and then on the right hand side you see the DNA structure, the double helical structure and the genes. Now, it has been understood that there are certain traits that pass from parents to children. Okay. Now, behavioral genetics is that branch of science which basically looks at the passage of traits from the parents to children. Now, remember, we are not talking about the passage of genes from parents to children, rather we are talking about the traits. If you remember, the trait approach to personality talks about certain basic predispositions, certain basic characteristics, cardinal traits, secondary traits. Okay. So, actually what happens, behavioral genetics understands, accepts and explains that the traits they pass from parents to children, and this is how it gets transmitted from one generation to the other. The second important thing, that environment also exerts certain selective demand. So, the environment in which you are, it compels you to adapt to the situation, and therefore, certain demands are exerted on you. Now, human beings, they live at the intersection of these two. So, you have the passage of the traits, you have the passage of the genes, and at the same time there are certain extraneous demands that the environment impose on you, and therefore, what happens, the nature and the nurture, they act together to shape us as an individual, the way we look in our real life to others. Now, DNA is basically comprised of 4 different nucleotides, which are also called as bases. Adenine, thymine, guanine and cytosine. So, these are the 4 bases, these are the 4 nucleotides. Now, what happens that these nucleotides, they form pairs. So, AT and CG, these are the 2 pairs. So, adenine and thymine, they pair together, and cytosine and guanine, they pair together. Now, the genes that we are talking about, they are basically segments of DNA that carry instructions for making any specific protein, okay, and sometime it could be even true for certain RNAs also. Now, on your screen what you see is the structure of adenine, thymine, cytosine and guanine, how they look like chemically, okay, and when they form the pair, now cytosine and guanine you see on the top and adenine and thymine you see at the bottom. So, this is the pair that we have. So, the double helical structure of gene that we have, okay, we have a sequence of ATCG bonds that is overlaid over it. Now, a gene might have few hundred to over a million base pairs, okay, and as we discussed right now that we all have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and a chromosome has some few hundred to few thousand genes, and these 23 pairs of chromosomes, they constitute the human genome, and hence we all have somewhere around 30,000 to 40,000 genes in us and approximately 6 billion DNA base pairs. Now we come to mutation. Mutation basically is a process of change in the genomic sequence, and such changes basically it could range from a single DNA base to a segment of a chromosome. Mutations are of two types, the germline mutation and the somatic mutation. Germline mutation basically is hereditary mutation. So, it is inherited from the parents. Such type of changes which gets transmitted to the child from their biological parents, that is germline mutation. But if you acquire the change, so if mutation is there in the DNA of certain cells due to environmental factors, say for instance ultraviolet radiation, little later we will come to one such example also. So, if you have a change, a mutation which is a consequence of an environmental factor, then it is called as somatic mutation. Now, although all of us share obvious body parts, none of us exactly look alike. So, my face is different from yours, yours is different from the third person, and even this variation between the human beings that you see, it could be either because of mutation, germline or the somatic mutation, or it could be because of recombination. So, even identical twins, they might have no difference in the shape of the face, even though they share same DNA, and they also differ in terms of even metabolism of specific substances. We will take the example of phenylketonuria a little later. Now, let us talk about recombination. So, right now we talked about mutation, both the germline and the somatic mutation, one that is inherited in nature and the other one which is acquired, which is a consequence of environment. So, what basically we see here in terms of mutation is that there is a role played by the genetic factor and there is also a effective role that is played by the environmental factor, and therefore, both these factors they play their own significant role as far as mutation is concerned. Now, we are coming to recombination. In normal circumstances, one inherits one chromosome from the father and one from the mother, and this process is repeated in the next generation as well. However, this chromosome is not the intact one that you inherit from the mother and the father, rather it is a combination of the two, and this recombination is basically the genetic mechanism of producing more and more genetic variation. And such variation would not have been possible had the whole chromosome been transmitted. So, the whole chromosome is not transmitted and therefore, it facilitates the process of genetic variation, and these variations are considered to be desirable. The reason being that if variation does not take place, then what would happen, that the likelihood of the survival of any species would be minimal if there is a change in the environmental circumstance. Now, think of various types of environmental changes that takes place. You realize that species which have more and more genetic variations, they survive. So, if say we are somewhere, if 10 of us are there and if there is, and we all are genetically different, and if there is a variation in the environment which makes one of us succumb to that variation, at least 9 would survive, and if several such sequences come, then also human race will finally succeed surviving, simply because all 10 of us were genetically very different. So, you can think the number of variations, the type of variations, the extent of variation in the human race, and why this is a desirable trait, simply because it allows the human race to survive irrespective of all types of changes that takes place in the environment. Now, we come to certain important terminologies: polygenic, phenotypic, genotypic, dominant and recessive. These are the 5 terminologies that we will first define, and then we will talk again about the behavioral genetics. Let us come to polygenic now. This is a term which is used for traits whose phenotype is influenced by more than one gene. So, each of the gene has some additive effect. Now, what is phenotype? will come little later, but basically the physical appearance, for example, if you take now, if the physical appearance is determined by more than one gene, where each gene makes some additive effect. So, if there are 7 separate genes which determines the phenotype that you are looking at, and all of them have some incremental effect. So, sum total of the 7 genes, their effect becomes a particular phenotype, and each of them defines one aspect of it. So, that is polygenic, because it is more than one. Then we come to phenotypic. This is of course the observable trait. So, physical appearance, for instance, anything that you can observe in the living organism, that is the phenotype. Then we come to the genotype, which is the reverse of phenotype. Genotype represents the genetic makeup of the living organism, and because it is genetic makeup, therefore you cannot actually observe it. So, basically it is the biologist who map your genetic makeup, and that genetic makeup tells you why you are having a particular type of a trait, visible trait, and why your children have a different trait which you do not have. Say for instance, you are a black eyed person, the color of the eyeball is black, and you realize that one of your child has a brown eyeball. Okay. Now, there is a variation. Overtly you think that phenotypically you are black eyed person, whereas there could be a possibility that the genetic makeup that you have basically has a recessive character. Okay. So, the dominant one, right now we will talk about the dominant and the recessive genes also, but the dominant one gets represented, and therefore, what you see outwardly, the phenotypic trait, that is of the black eyeball that we are talking about, is not something which actually gets equally represented in your genetic makeup. So, in your genetic makeup you have a dominant blackness of the eyeball, whereas you have a recessive brownness of the eye, and therefore, the child, the biological offspring has a phenotypic trait which actually represents the recessive character that you were carrying in your gene. So, there is always something more to phenotypic trait that is observed to the outer world, okay, which is apparent in the genetic makeup. So, genetic makeup has a larger and broader image of what you actually carry besides what you actually look like. Then we come to the dominant genes, genes whose inheritance makes the outward display of the trait. Okay. So, basically those genes which expresses itself. Right now the example that we took, the say black eye, color of the skin, color of the hair, texture of the hair, all of these are dominant genes, whereas the genes which do not allow itself to get expressed completely, basically the dominant gene does not allow them to express, those genes are called recessive genes. Okay. So, the brownness of the eyeball that we were referring to was the recessive trait that you were carrying, your genetic makeup had that, whereas the black dominant eyeball was the trait that got reflected in you, and that dominant gene did not allow the recessive one, the brownness, to get reflected in you. Recessive gene we have talked about, as the name suggests, they are basically masked by the dominant gene. So, they are expressed only in the homozygous state.
Let us understand genetic inheritance of traits by this example. Here you have the father and the mother who are carriers of a given disease. The blue color represents unaffected individuals, whereas the black color represents individuals affected by the disease. Combination of both the colors represent that the individuals are carrier of the disease. Here, when both the parents are carriers, the first offspring is completely unaffected by the disease. The second and the third offspring are carriers, whereas the fourth offspring is affected by the disease. Now, the big question is to understand the relative contribution of genetic inheritance and environmental determinants of any human behavior. We have seen that we have the dominant genes, we have the recessive genes, we have seen how a combination of genes, they affect the behavior, in the polygenic state. There are dominant genes that does not allow the expression of a particular trait, but then you also have selective demands that are put forward by the environmental conditions. And for the healthy survival, one has to actually show competence that irrespective of the adversity of the environmental condition, one can survive.
So, having defined these 4-5 definitions and having understood that there is a beauty and there is a biological mechanism of mutation and recombination which makes us look different. Now, when we meet next, we would be talking about behavioral genetics.